There's a lot of factors to consider with establishing dry bean, but I selected 4 that I want to talk about and share with you this morning. As listed, we'll talk a bit about tillage systems, rye as a cover crop before pinto bean, and then we'll spend some time looking at some of our research recommendations on row spacing and plant population, and then we'll end with ground rolling. So before I get into the discussion, I want to mention that Extension as well as Northarvest each year conducts a survey of growers, and the 2019 data has just become available. So this is available electronically, and it's a real nice reference for experienced growers as well as people just considering growing beans for the first time in 2020. And I'll be using some of the data to introduce these establishment factors. And so the first factor is tillage systems. And based on the survey, this is the percent of acres related with the various tillage systems. And so the majority of folks are conventional tillers, a little over 70%. Now the Northarvest region does refer to North Dakota as well as Minnesota. And so you notice also that the balance of the acres are some type of conservation tillage, so about 30%. And so we assume these people are successful with those systems, and we like to have people consider transitioning to those because of some of the concerns we have with the conventional tillage. You know, a big concern, of course, would be the soils at high risk for erosion. In addition, it may be more difficult to manage our soil moisture with conventional tillage, and certainly it requires more passes across the field for establishing and harvesting the crop. NDSU has some information available on comparing tillage systems. So this is some work that we did at Carrington, is where we used small grain as the previous crop. So working with small grain residue. This is on soil that's well-drained loam soil. And so we compared conventional tillage with strip till as well as direct seeded. And you notice the 5-year average is indicating a yield very similar to the conventional tillage. So we maintain our yield, and yet we realize the benefits of conservation tillage, such as moisture management and reduction of soil erosion, etc. You might wonder why the direct seeded was less. The trials are always planted at the same time, so very likely in the direct seeded environment we had cooler and probably wetter soils. If we could have replaced this with a long-term no-till system, I suspect that the yields are very similar to these other systems, in particular to the conventional till system. So again, just to plant a seed on folks that are conventional till, we certainly can realize success with going with a conservation tillage system. All right, a second factor is use of cover crops. And again, I'll refer to the brand new data from 2019 obtained from the grower survey. And we found that of the people that responded to the survey, about a quarter of them actually used cover crops in one way or another on dry bean fields. And in 2017 was the first time we asked this question. And so we're up about 10 percentage points. We do have a long way to go yet, but we like to see some progress and more people considering this strategy. And notice the reasons for the cover crop use. Essentially everyone is interested in soil conservation, and certainly there's interest in using cover crops as another tool for managing weeds and also to manage soil moisture. We also asked folks what type of cover crops they're using, and the majority are using cereal grasses, and I suspect that most of them are using winter rye. And so I want to share some information from you on a study that we started actually in the fall of 2017, where we're looking at winter rye as a cover crop before pinto beans. And there's people, commercial growers certainly, that are doing this. This is a picture of a couple commercial fields that were taken in the past. This study is being supported by Northarvest, and we're trying to answer some basic questions. One is, if we use this system, using rye before pinto bean, can we still maintain yields compared to the conventional system? And if so, what's the best time to terminate rye? And also, is rye indeed a weed suppression tool that we can utilize? And so this is a look at last year's treatment list and the resulting yield from it. I want to show this detail or these details because it's hard to make a broad statement about a result without you knowing some of the particulars on it. And so our treatments are based primarily on when we terminate the rye. And so we started with the unconventional check, treatment number 1, where in the fall, we planted a rye block, and then we tilled the conventional check treatments. And then we followed that with the early spring application of glyphosate about 1 month before we planted the beans. And we used palomino. They were direct planted into the various types of residue at 21-inch rows. And this was done on June 3rd last year. And then we also included a pre-emergence herbicide, again, to try to mimic a conventional production system. And then the balance of the treatments all relate to termination timing with using glyphosate. So it was about 1 month before we planted the beans. Treatment 3 is 1 month, but we also included a pre-emergence herbicide just to see what impact the early termination try had on suppressing weeds. And then treatments 4, 5, and 6 were just terminating the rye closer to planting time, about 3 weeks before, just a few days before. Sometimes we refer to this as planting the dry beans green. And then we also had a treatment where we terminated the rye about a week after we planted the dry bean. In 2019, as well as in the previous 2 years, 2017 and 18, we had fairly dry soil profile and a dry spring. And so you see the trend here that we did have reduced yield by delaying the termination of the rye until at or after planting time. This slide gives us a better picture. This is the 3-year average on selected treatments on termination timing and the resulting yield. So notice that when we used glyphosate only about a month before we planted the beans, we certainly were able to maintain the yield as compared to the conventional system. However, because of the dryness all 3 years of the trial, we certainly saw a loss in yield when we delayed the rye termination until around planting time. And ultimately, it just allowed the rye to take moisture that was needed in the season for the dry beans to yield well. The downside is that when we remove the rye early, there's less residue present and less capability to suppress weeds, maybe take up excessive moisture. I suspect this year, when we establish our trial with a loaded profile with moisture, that we may be very successful with planting green by terminating the rye right at planting time. So this is just a summary of our notes from the study so far. We are continuing the trial in 2020. So the big thing is that we can maintain yields with the system. Just watch the termination timing of the rye. So far with dry springs, we found 3 to 4 weeks before bean planting would be the best. Another thing we found too is make sure that we have adequate number of seeds that we're planting, because with our single disc opener that we have, we've tried to drop sufficient seeds, but we've come up a little short compared to our optimum stand. So just be aware of that. Hans mentioned that we revised our new dry bean production guide, and within that we do have a table that suggests plant populations based on market classes. So I want to talk a bit about plant populations as well as row spacings, and most importantly, the interaction. And I'll be focusing on the black, the navy, and the pinto beans because we have NDSU data behind our plant population recommendations. For the other market classes, we're utilizing universities from the region, and we don't have data or very limited data in North Dakota for these specialty market types. So let's talk a little bit about our work that we've done on black, navy, and pinto bean. And we're very interested in the interaction row spacing and plant population. In other words, finding that sweet spot between these two factors to optimize our yield and returns for dry beans. And this study has been supported by Northarvest. So I'll give you an idea of what we were doing with when we initiated the study using black and navy bean. We were looking at 3 row spacings, 14, 21, and 28, and then targeted stands of 90, 110, and 130,000 plants as an early population. And the numbers in white would be our standards. So we saw a statistically significant interaction with the two factors with a navy bean. And so note that we planted 100, 125, and 150,000 seeds per acre. And then we ended up averaging in actual stand as listed below, about 93,000, a little over 115,000, and then close to 140,000 plants per acre. So what do we find with the navies on yield? Our top yields were when we planted in 14-inch rows, and we planted at the medium and high rates, resulting in these eventual stands. And of course, we did the same work with the blacks, but we didn't get a response in particular with row spacing, and very little response with plant populations. We had to go very high in order to see a very modest yield response compared to the population under 100,000. And you already saw the data with the navies, but based on this work, we're suggesting that people consider narrow rows and then have plant populations of at least 150,000 plants per acre. Because in the data, in the research, we've seen some very nice yield responses. If you want details about this work, we do have a publication you can refer to. So let's move to Pinto bean. And this is work that was done about a decade ago in eastern North Dakota, comparing 3 row spacings. And we found the advantage to be with the intermediate row spacing, in this case, 18 inches. Yield increases anywhere from 11 to 16% compared to the other 2 row spacings. And then more recent work done at Carrington, we have 5 site years of work simply comparing wide to intermediate row spacing. And we saw a nice yield response, certainly with intermediate rows. Now, it's fairly common for people to stick with wide rows with pinto beans because of certainly the threat of white mold. Michael Wunsch, our plant pathologist at Carrington, has been working with this in his disease management trials, looking at row spacing and the impact. And so just recently he came out with a summary of his first years of work at Carrington and Oaks. It's actually 13 site years of work, so it's a substantial database. And what he found was that there was a yield advantage with the narrow rows over the wide rows, even with substantial white mold pressure. For example, at severities at about 25 to 50% and even up to 75%, there were still these average yield responses with the narrow rows versus with the wide rows. And then he found that there was only a yield advantage with wide rows when he had a very high level of severity of white mold. Michael has continued the work, the second phase of it, and this will be continued into 2020, where he's looking at 4 row spacings, and then I think in 2021 variety. So I'll stay tuned to that, but I think you'll find this information of interest if you're sticking with wide rows because of white mold pressure. And then let's take a look at plant populations. This is 4 site years of work at Carrington, looking at our standard plant population compared to reducing it. And we saw a yield advantage sticking with our recommended level of 70,000 plants per acre. A smaller database where we can include 3 different plant populations. This was, again, at Carrington. We had plant populations just under 60, 75, and then 90. And notice that the 2 higher populations had 9 and 11% respectively yield advantage compared to the reduced rate. Again, this is only 2 site years of work. We'll continue this. I was a bit surprised that there wasn't more of a yield response over the years, but let's look at this a little bit closer. This is preliminary data, 2 set years of data, where we have both of the factors, row spacing and plant population. And I picked out 2 of the treatments, the wide rows with the planting rate that established 67,000 plants per acre and the resulting yield. Now look at the intermediate row spacing, where we were able to establish about 90,000 plants per acre. We did see a nice bump in yield. And when I applied the basic arithmetic to this, the increased market income that we got with the higher yield, but subtracting the increased planting rate, it was a substantial increase in net revenue by going with this combination of intermediate rows and a higher plant density. But again, this is preliminary. We'll see what the data shows in the future. The last component is ground rolling. Of course, we do this to smooth the soil surface by pushing rocks down below the soil surface and breaking up clods in order to have an efficient harvest. In being able to harvest more quickly and reducing risk to combine damage, and ultimately putting more beans in the truck box. And so we're referring to the survey again, and notice that about 2/3 of the dry bean growers are rolling at least part of their acreage in order to be efficient with their direct harvesting methods. And also note that within the group on timing of the bean rolling, or the ground rolling, excuse me, you see that most people are using the pre-emergence timing before the beans are up. But the question is, what will happen if for whatever reason we are forced to roll after the beans have emerged? And I'm not aware of any NDSU or U of M data, but there is some from Manitoba. It's rather old, but it tells, I think, a good story. So their treatments, and this was with pinto bean, included no rolling before emergence, and then rolling about a week after the plants had emerged. Notice that there was no difference in yield, no difference in stand, but there was some damaged plants that occurred, as you would expect, when the rolling was done after the plants are up. And what's interesting is we've done a fair amount of work with rolling ground for soybean, both by NDSU and the University of Minnesota. And the data we found from the soybean corresponds very closely to what they found in this study done in Canada. So if a person is rolling after the beans are up, we would suggest rolling as early as possible. So to summarize, consider reduced till systems, for dry bean because of the soil and economic benefits. We're finding that rye is working very well as a cover crop before dry beans, as long as it's properly managed. And then rows in plant population. For row spacing, our data is indicating navies in fairly narrow rows have a nice advantage in yield. With pintos, the intermediate row spacing looks very positive. And then considering plant population along with narrow rows, with navies, and I put in parentheses blacks because there's certainly less response there, we would suggest plant populations of 115,000 or more plants per acre. And with pintos, we're still working on this database, but continue with at least 70,000 plants per acre. And with ground rolling, pre-emergence is ideal. If we wait until after the plants are up, roll as early as possible to minimize the impacts. And that'll do it for my presentation.